Story 1: The Hitchhiker's Warning. In the summer of 1995, Jake and his best friend Mike decided to take a cross-country road trip from California to New York. They had just graduated from college and wanted to celebrate their newfound freedom with one last adventure before starting their careers. They packed Jake's old Ford Bronco with camping gear, snacks, and a map with a carefully planned route that avoided major highways to give them a more scenic, memorable journey. Jake and Mike had known each other since high school, and they had been through a lot together. This road trip was meant to be a bonding experience, a final hurrah before they entered the real world. They laughed about their past escapades and talked about their future plans, feeling a mix of excitement and apprehension about what lay ahead. On the third night, as they drove through the desolate stretches of Route 66 in Arizona, the desert seemed to stretch endlessly around them. The sun had set hours ago, and the only light came from their headlights cutting through the darkness. The open road, which had initially felt liberating, now seemed intimidating and vast. The emptiness was palpable, the only sound being the hum of the Bronco's engine and the occasional howl of the wind. As they chatted and listened to music, trying to keep their spirits up, they saw a figure up ahead on the side of the road, illuminated briefly in their high beams. A hitchhiker, an older man in ragged clothes, was waving them down. His face was gaunt, his eyes wide and desperate. Against his better judgment, Jake slowed the car and pulled over. Mike rolled down the window just enough to speak to the man. "Can I help you, sir?" he asked cautiously, sensing something wasn't right. "Thank you, boys. I've been out here for hours," the man said, his voice rough and weak. "My car broke down about a mile back. I was heading to a gas station I think is up ahead, but I could use a ride if you don't mind." Jake and Mike exchanged glances. The man didn't seem dangerous, just tired and desperate. He looked like he had been out in the elements for days, his skin sunburned and cracked. Despite the uneasy feeling in his gut, Jake nodded, and they agreed to give him a lift to the nearest gas station. As the man got into the back seat, Jake noticed the foul stench of sweat and something else, something metallic, like blood. He tried to ignore it as he pulled back onto the road, but his mind kept drifting back to the strange odor. Mike, who was usually chatty, fell silent, occasionally glancing back at the man in the rearview mirror. The hitchhiker introduced himself as Tom, but that was all he said. He didn't offer any more details about himself, and when Jake and Mike asked where he was from, he avoided eye contact and mumbled something incoherent. He was fidgety and kept looking out the back window, almost as if he was expecting someone or something to appear behind them. After about 10 minutes, the gas station came into view, an old, dimly lit building with a flickering neon sign. The pumps looked ancient, and there was a single car parked under a broken streetlight. Jake pulled into the lot, and the man quickly jumped out, mumbling a quick thank you before hurrying inside. Jake and Mike watched him disappear into the building, feeling a strange sense of relief. They decided to fill up their tank while they were there, and Jake went inside to pay. The interior of the gas station was just as rundown as the outside. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. A few old, dusty shelves held a sparse selection of snacks and drinks, and an old radio played static in the background. Jake approached the counter, where an elderly woman with a thick southern accent was reading a tattered magazine. She looked up as he handed her his credit card, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Why all picked up that man out there?" she asked, glancing toward the entrance. "Yeah," Jake replied. "His car broke down, and we gave him a ride." "Why?" The woman's face paled, and she leaned in closer. "Honey, there ain't been no cars broken down on this road for weeks. And that man? He's bad news. Local legend says he's been haunting these parts for years. People who pick him up usually never make it to their destination." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. He quickly paid for the gas and rushed outside to tell Mike what he had heard. But as he stepped out of the gas station, he saw the hitchhiker standing at the edge of the lot, staring directly at him. His eyes glowed eerily in the darkness, and a slow, twisted smile spread across his face. Without saying a word, the hitchhiker turned and walked into the night, disappearing into the shadows. Jake and Mike didn't wait around to find out more. They jumped into the Bronco and sped off, their hearts racing. For the rest of their trip, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Even after they returned home, they both had nightmares about the hitchhiker's glowing eyes and that unsettling smile, wondering if the man they had picked up was truly alive or something far more sinister. Months later, Jake couldn't resist looking up local legends of Route 66. He found stories about a man named Tom who was murdered on that stretch of road back in the 1960s. He was left for dead by a group of drifters who had robbed him. People said his ghost still haunted the highway, looking for those who would help him find his way back home. Jake shuddered as he realized they might have encountered something supernatural that night, a lost soul, doomed to wander the desert forever. Story 2: The Abandoned Motel. In the early 2000s, Laura and her younger sister, Megan, set out on a road trip from Seattle to Albuquerque. They wanted to visit their grandmother, who had recently moved to a small town in New Mexico. Their parents couldn't make the trip, so Laura, being the older sister at 25, took it upon herself to drive Megan, who was 19 and full of excitement for the journey. The first couple of days went smoothly. They enjoyed the scenic views, sang along to their favorite songs, and made frequent stops to take pictures. They stayed in cozy motels and ate at charming diners along the way. The sisters had always been close, and this trip was a chance for them to reconnect after Megan had moved away for college. But on the third night, they found themselves driving through a remote part of Utah. The sun had set hours ago, and they hadn't seen a town or gas station for miles. The vast, empty landscape was beautiful during the day, but became unnerving in the dark. The road seemed to stretch on forever, with no end in sight. As the hours passed, fatigue set in, and they decided it was best to find a place to rest for the night. Megan spotted a sign for a motel off a small exit, and they decided to check it out. The exit led them down a narrow, winding road that seemed to go on forever. The farther they drove, the more isolated they felt. The only sound was the crunch of gravel under their tires and the occasional hoot of an owl. Just when they were about to turn back, they saw a flickering neon sign in the distance cliffside motel. The motel looked like it had seen better days. The paint was peeling, and the windows were dark, but they had no other options. They parked and went inside, where they were greeted by an elderly woman behind the counter. "Need a room for the night?" she asked with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Her voice was raspy, and her skin was pale and wrinkled, giving her an almost ghostly appearance. "Yes, please," Laura replied, handing over her credit card. The woman took it and handed them a key. "Room 8, down the hall to your left." The sisters made their way to the room, which smelled musty and looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. The wallpaper was faded, and the carpet was worn and stained. The furniture was old and mismatched, and the bedspread looked like it hadn't been washed in years. But it was clean enough, and they were too tired to care. They quickly changed into their pajamas and climbed into the 2 twin beds, eager to get some sleep. But as soon as they turned out the lights, strange noises began. It sounded like footsteps shuffling outside their door, followed by a faint whispering that seemed to come from the walls. Megan sat up, her eyes wide with fear. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Laura nodded, trying to stay calm. "It's probably just the wind or an old building settling. Let's just try to get some sleep." But the noises only grew louder. The footsteps seemed to be moving up and down the hallway, accompanied by a low, guttural growl that sent chills down their spines. The sisters clung to each other, too scared to move. Suddenly, there was a loud bang on their door, followed by a voice that sounded like it was right in the room with them, even though no one was there. "Get out," it screamed, echoing through the walls. Terrified, Laura and Megan jumped out of bed and grabbed their things. They ran out of the room and down the hall, their hearts pounding in their chests. When they reached the front desk, the old woman was gone, and the lobby was dark and empty. They didn't bother checking out. They just got into their car and sped off, not stopping until they reached a well-lit gas station miles away. As they caught their breath and tried to make sense of what had happened, a trucker approached them, noticing their frantic state. "You okay?" he asked, his face filled with concern. "We stayed at this motel back there," Megan blurted out, and there was something something wrong with it. The trucker's face grew serious. You mean the Cliffside Motel? The sisters nodded, and the trucker shook his head. That place has been abandoned for over 30 years. Used to be a nice place, but then there was a fire, and the owner's wife died in it. People say her spirit still haunts the place, trying to drive away anyone who stays there. Laura and Megan looked at each other in horror, realizing they had just spent the night in a haunted motel. They didn't say another word as they filled up their tank and continued their journey, vowing never to take another detour again. The sisters eventually made it to Albuquerque, but the experience at the Cliffside Motel left a lasting impression on them. They couldn't shake the feeling that they had encountered something otherworldly that night, something that defied explanation. And they both knew they would never forget the eerie warning they had received from beyond the grave. Story 3: The Ghostly Trooper. Nathan and Jessica had been dating for 2 years when they decided to take a road trip across the Southwest. Both were avid hikers and nature enthusiasts, and they had planned their trip to include visits to several national parks. They were looking forward to exploring the natural beauty of the region, camping under the stars, and spending some quality time together away from the hustle and bustle of their everyday lives. They set off from their home in Denver with high spirits, driving through the picturesque landscapes of Colorado, Utah, and Arizona. They made stops at the Grand Canyon, Zion National Park, and Monument Valley, taking in the breathtaking views and capturing memories with their camera. It was the perfect trip, and they couldn't have been happier. But on their way to Carlsbad Caverns in New Mexico, things took a strange turn. It was late in the afternoon when they found themselves on a lonely stretch of highway, miles from the nearest town. The sky was overcast, and the wind had picked up, sending tumbleweeds skittering across the road. The vast emptiness of the desert made them feel small and isolated, and an eerie sense of foreboding settled over them. As they drove, they saw a flash of blue and red lights in their rearview mirror. Jessica, who was driving, slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road, thinking they were about to be stopped for speeding. But when the police car came to a halt behind them, they realized something was off. The car looked old, like it hadn't been used in decades, and the officer who stepped out was wearing an outdated uniform. The trooper approached their car slowly, his face obscured by dark aviator sunglasses and a wide-brimmed hat. He tapped on the window with a gloved hand, and Jessica rolled it down, feeling a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. "Evening, folks," the trooper said, his voice calm and steady. "Mind telling me where you're headed?" "We're on our way to Carlsbad Caverns," Nathan replied, trying to sound casual. "Is there a problem, officer?" The trooper didn't answer right away. He seemed to be studying them, his gaze hidden behind his sunglasses. Finally he spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "There's a storm coming. You two should find somewhere to stay for the night. This road isn't safe in bad weather." Jessica and Nathan exchanged a puzzled look. The weather didn't seem that bad, just a little windy. And besides, they hadn't seen any signs of a storm on the forecast. But before they could ask the trooper any more questions, he turned and walked back to his car, disappearing into the shadows. Confused and a little spooked, Jessica pulled back onto the road and continued driving. But the trooper's warning lingered in their minds, and they couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. A few miles down the road, they saw a small gas station and decided to stop to get some information. As they pulled up to the pump, an elderly man stepped out of the station's convenience store, wiping his hands on a rag. "Can I help you folks?" he asked, eyeing their car with curiosity. "We were stopped by a state trooper a few miles back," Nathan explained. "He said there was a storm coming and that we should find a place to stay for the night. Do you know anything about that?" The old man's face paled, and he shook his head slowly. "A trooper, you say? On that road?" "Yes," Jessica replied. "He had an old patrol car and was wearing an old uniform. It seemed strange." The man's eyes widened, and he took a step back, crossing himself. "Lord have mercy," he muttered under his breath. "That road ... it's known for ghost sightings. Years ago, a state trooper died in a hit and run out there during a storm. They say his spirit still patrols the highway, warning travelers of danger." Jessica and Nathan felt a chill run down their spines. They thanked the old man and quickly got back in their car, eager to put some distance between them and the eerie encounter. But as they drove away, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The sky grew darker, and the wind picked up, whipping sand and dust across the road. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and flashes of lightning illuminated the barren landscape. Nathan and Jessica exchanged worried glances, realizing that the trooper's warning might have been more than just a ghost story. As the storm rolled in, the rain began to pour down in sheets, making it nearly impossible to see. Jessica gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white, as she struggled to keep the car on the road. The wind howled around them, and the rain pounded against the windows, creating an almost deafening noise. Suddenly, a blinding flash of lightning struck a tree on the side of the road, sending it crashing down in front of them. Jessica swerved to avoid it, the car skidding on the slick pavement. They came to a stop just inches from the fallen tree, their hearts racing. Breathing heavily, they looked at each other, their faces pale with fear. They knew they couldn't continue driving in these conditions. They would have to wait out the storm. Nathan grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment, and they decided to check the area for shelter. As they stepped out into the rain, they saw a small building up ahead, partially hidden by the darkness. It looked like an old rest stop, abandoned and forgotten. They ran toward it, their clothes quickly becoming soaked in the downpour. When they reached the building, they found the door unlocked and hurried inside, grateful for the shelter. The interior was dark and musty, with peeling wallpaper and broken furniture scattered around. It was clear that no one had been there in a long time. They found a corner to huddle in and tried to make themselves comfortable, listening to the storm rage outside. But as they sat there, they couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The air felt heavy, and an eerie silence filled the room, broken only by the occasional creak of the old building settling. Suddenly they heard footsteps echoing down the hallway, slow and deliberate. Jessica and Nathan froze, their hearts pounding in their chests. The footsteps grew closer, stopping just outside the room they were in. They held their breath, waiting for whatever was out there to make its move. But instead, they heard a voice, low and gravelly, just like the troopers. "You shouldn't have come here." Jessica and Nathan jumped up, shining the flashlight toward the door. But there was no one there. The hallway was empty, the darkness stretching out before them like a void. Panicked, they grabbed their things and ran back to their car, not stopping until they were miles away from the rest stop. They drove through the night, not daring to look back, the troopers' warning echoing in their minds. When they finally reached a small town the next morning, they checked into a motel and collapsed onto the bed, exhausted and shaken. They knew they had encountered something otherworldly that night, something that defied explanation. And they both knew they would never forget the ghostly trooper who had saved their lives. Story 4: The Forest of Lost Souls. In the summer of 1987, a group of college friends from Ohio State University, Tom, Lisa, Greg, and Sarah decided to take a road trip to explore the Appalachian Mountains. They were eager to camp out in the wilderness, enjoy nature, and get away from the stresses of school. They packed a tent, supplies, and a map they had found in an old bookstore, which promised an off-the-beaten-path experience. The four friends had been close since freshman year, bonding over their shared love of hiking and adventure. They had planned this trip for months, mapping out their route and gathering supplies. They wanted to make the most of their summer break before their senior year, knowing it might be their last chance to go on an adventure together before they graduated and went their separate ways. The first few days of the trip were perfect. They hiked through lush forests, swam in crystal-clear streams, and roasted marshmallows over a campfire each night. The group felt free and alive, enjoying the simple pleasures of the great outdoors. But on the fourth day, as they were driving through a dense forest in West Virginia, they took a wrong turn. The narrow, winding road led them deeper into the woods, far from any sign of civilization. The trees grew thicker, their branches forming a canopy overhead that blocked out the sun. The air grew colder, and an eerie silence settled over the forest. As they tried to find their way back to the main road, they came across an old, rusted sign that read "Welcome to Lost Hollow." Intrigued by the name, they decided to explore the area, thinking it might be a fun detour. They followed the road until they reached a clearing, where they found an abandoned campground. The picnic tables were overturned, and the fire pits were filled with ashes. The cabins were dilapidated, their windows broken and doors hanging off their hinges. It looked like no one had been there in decades. "This place gives me the creeps," Lisa said, shivering despite the warm summer air. "Yeah, let's not stay here too long," Greg agreed, glancing around nervously. But Tom, ever the adventurer, wanted to explore. "Come on, guys, let's check it out. It's probably just an old campground that got abandoned for some reason. It could be fun to look around." Reluctantly, the others agreed, and they got out of the car, walking through the deserted campground. As they explored, they found an old playground with rusted swings and a slide that had collapsed into the dirt. There was a small pond with murky water, its surface covered in algae. The whole place had an eerie, unsettling vibe, like it was frozen in time. The trees around the clearing seemed to lean in, their branches creaking in the wind, casting long, twisted shadows on the ground. As they walked, they heard a faint whispering coming from the trees, like the wind was carrying voices from the past. At first, they thought it was just their imagination, but the whispers grew louder, and they could make out words that didn't make sense. Lost ... Forever ... Leave ... Now the voices seemed to say, repeating over and over. Sarah, who had been quiet up until now, grabbed Tom's arm. "We need to go," she said, her voice trembling. "Something's not right here." Tom, sensing her fear, nodded. "Yeah, let's get out of here. This place is creeping me out." They hurried back to the car, but as they reached it, they heard a loud crack, like a tree branch snapping. They turned to see a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, shrouded in shadows. The figure was tall and gaunt, its eyes glowing a sickly yellow in the darkness. Without a word, they jumped into the car and sped off, not daring to look back. As they drove, the forest seemed to close in around them, the trees twisting and contorting, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. They drove for hours, trying to find their way back to the main road, but the forest seemed endless, like it was deliberately keeping them trapped. The whispers grew louder, filling their ears with a cacophony of voices, all repeating the same words: lost ... Forever ... Now. Finally, just as they were about to lose hope, they saw a break in the trees and burst out onto a paved road. They drove until they reached a small town, where they found a diner and pulled in, exhausted and shaken. As they sat in the diner, trying to calm their nerves, an old man approached them, his face lined with age and wisdom. "You folks look like you've seen a ghost," he said with a chuckle. "We were in the woods," Tom explained, "at a place called Lost Hollow. Do you know anything about it?" The old man's face grew serious, and he nodded slowly. "Lost Hollow, you say? That place is cursed. Folks who go in there don't usually come out. It's said to be a gateway to another world, a place where lost souls wander forever." The friends stared at him in disbelief, realizing they had narrowly escaped something far more sinister than they could have imagined. They thanked the old man and quickly left the diner, eager to put as much distance as possible between them and the haunted forest. They continued their road trip, but the experience in Lost Hollow haunted them for the rest of their journey. They couldn't shake the feeling that they had come dangerously close to becoming lost souls themselves, trapped in that cursed forest forever. Years later, whenever they got together, they would talk about their road trip and the strange, terrifying encounter they had in Lost Hollow. And they would always agree on one thing: some places are best left unexplored. Story 5: The Phantom of Route 666. In the late 1990s, a young couple named Mark and Emily decided to take a road trip from their home in Phoenix, Arizona, to San Antonio, Texas. Mark had just returned from a deployment overseas, and they wanted to spend some quality time together before he had to return to base. They packed their bags, loaded up their car, and set off on a journey that would take them through the heart of the American Southwest. They had planned a route that would take them through some of the most beautiful and remote areas of the country, including a stretch of highway known as Route 666. The road, which ran through the desert landscape of New Mexico, was notorious for its desolate scenery and eerie reputation. Locals called it the Devil's Highway and there were countless stories of strange occurrences and unexplained phenomena along the route. Mark and Emily weren't superstitious, and they didn't believe in ghost stories. They were more interested in the scenic views and the adventure of exploring a new place. They set off down Route 666 with a sense of excitement, eager to see what the road had in store for them. The first part of the drive was uneventful. They passed through small towns and wide-open stretches of desert, enjoying the stark beauty of the landscape. But as the sun began to set, the mood changed. The sky turned a deep shade of red, casting an eerie glow over the road. The wind picked up, sending dust swirling across the pavement. As they drove, they noticed a figure standing by the side of the road up ahead. It was a woman, wearing a long, flowing dress that billowed in the wind. Her hair was long and dark, and she was holding a lantern, its light flickering in the dusk. Mark slowed the car as they approached, thinking the woman might need help. But as they got closer, Emily gasped. The woman's eyes were empty sockets, and her face was pale and lifeless, like a porcelain doll. "Keep driving," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. Mark nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He pressed down on the accelerator, speeding past the ghostly figure. As they drove away, Emily turned to look back, but the woman had vanished. They continued down the road, the atmosphere growing more oppressive with each passing mile. The wind howled around them, and the darkness seemed to close in, the desert stretching out like an endless void. The headlights of their car barely penetrated the thick blackness, and every shadow seemed to shift and move, as if alive. Suddenly, the car's engine sputtered, and the dashboard lights flickered. Mark cursed under his breath, pulling over to the side of the road. The car came to a stop, and they were plunged into darkness. "What the hell?" Mark muttered, turning the key in the ignition. But the engine wouldn't start. Emily looked around, her eyes wide with fear. "Mark, what's happening?" "I don't know," he replied, checking the dashboard. "Everything looks fine. It doesn't make any sense." As they sat there trying to figure out what to do, they heard a low, guttural growl coming from the darkness. It was followed by the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching on the gravel beside the road. Mark grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment and shone it out the window, but the beam only illuminated empty space. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and then stopped, right next to the car. Emily grabbed Mark's arm, her nails digging into his skin. "Mark, we need to get out of here. Now." Mark nodded, his heart racing. He tried the ignition again, and this time the engine roared to life. He slammed his foot on the gas pedal, the tires screeching as they sped away. As they drove, they heard a loud, bone-chilling scream echoing through the night. It was a scream of pure terror and agony, like someone or something was being tortured. Emily covered her ears, tears streaming down her face, while Mark gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying to keep the car on the road. They didn't stop until they reached the next town, where they found a small motel and checked in, still shaken by what had happened. That night, they couldn't sleep. Every creak and groan of the old building made them jump, and they kept the lights on, afraid of what might be lurking in the darkness. The next morning, they spoke to the motel owner about their experience on Route 666. The owner, a middle-aged man with a weathered face, listened intently, nodding as they recounted their story. "You're not the first to come through here with a tale like that," he said, his voice low. "Route 666 has a reputation. People say it's cursed. They see things, hear things that ain't right. Some say it's the ghosts of those who've died on that road. Others say it's something more sinister." Mark and Emily exchanged a glance, their faces pale. They thanked the owner and decided to change their route, avoiding Route 666 for the rest of their journey. They continued their road trip, but the memory of that night haunted them, a reminder of the strange and unexplainable things that lurk in the shadows of the world. And though they never spoke of it again, both of them knew that they would never forget the phantom of Route 666, the ghostly figure that had appeared out of nowhere, and the scream that still echoed in their minds, a chilling reminder that some roads are best left untraveled.